I didn't realize that being honest about the most painful moment of my life would suddenly make me the villain in my own story. They say the truth shall set you free, but in a room full of strangers, the truth can feel a lot more like a grenade. I never intended to make anyone uncomfortable. I never intended to suck the air out of the room or make a customer regret walking through my door. But there I was, standing behind the counter of the place I love most in the world, watching the colour drain from a woman's face just because I refused to lie about a ghost. It makes you wonder, why is it that society expects us to perform a script of politeness, even when that script denies our own reality? Why is my mother's death something I'm supposed to hide, just to keep a stranger's afternoon pleasant? By the time the sun set on that Tuesday, I wasn't just the owner of a quiet neighbourhood bookstore anymore. I was the person who had ruined the vibe, and the fallout was only just beginning. To understand how I ended up in the crosshairs of the politeness police, you have to understand the sanctuary I've built. I own a small, used bookstore. You know the kind. The ones that smell like a mix of old vanilla, aging paper, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar. It's a place where time seems to slow down. There are stacks of paperbacks that have been through dozens of hands, and hardcovers with gold-leafed spines that look like they belong in a museum. It's my life's work. When I bought the place a few years ago, I didn't just buy a business, I bought a legacy. The woman I bought it from is Gladys. Now, if you met Gladys, you wouldn't think, retired. She's 71, but she has the energy of a woman half her age. She's the kind of person who wears bright floral scarves and has a laugh that can be heard from the back of the mystery section. When we were closing the deal on the shop, she told me she wasn't quite ready to disappear into a rocking chair. She loved the books, but more than that, she loved the people. So, we made a deal. I hired her back. She works 1 day a week, usually Tuesdays, and she brings a touch of magic to the place that I'm still learning to replicate. Gladys doesn't just sell books, she sells memories. She also makes these incredible homemade jams and jellies, strawberry balsamic, spicy pepper, blackberry sage, that we sell in a little display near the register. On Tuesdays, the store smells like a combination of a library and a farmhouse kitchen. It's cozy, it's safe, or at least, it was. This particular Tuesday started out like any other. The morning light was filtering through the front window, dancing on the dust motes, and Gladys was behind the counter, regaling a regular customer with stories about her upcoming 6-week cruise. She was glowing, talking about the Mediterranean sun and the excursion she had planned. I was in the back, shelving a new shipment of Gothic horror novels, listening to the rhythmic chime of the bell above the door as people drifted in and out. Around mid-afternoon, the rush started. I took over the register to give Gladys a break so she could go tidy up the children's section. A woman approached the counter with a stack of historical romances and 2 jars of Gladys's famous raspberry jam. She was smiling, that pleasant, polite smile of someone enjoying a quiet afternoon of shopping. As I started scanning her books, she glanced over at Gladys, who was across the room, animatedly explaining the plot of a picture book to a toddler. The customer looked back at me, her eyes twinkling with what I thought was genuine warmth. "She's just lovely," the woman said, nodding toward Gladys. "It's so nice that you get to work with your mum every day. Does she make the jams too?" It was a simple question. A common mistake, I suppose. Gladys is the right age to be my mother. We both have a similar way of tilting our heads when we listen, and we both have a deep, abiding love for this shop. But we don't look alike. Not really. My mother had dark, curly hair and eyes the colour of flint. Gladys is all soft edges and silver waves. I didn't even think about it. I didn't pause to weigh the social implications of my response. I just gave her the truth, delivered with a small, reflexive laugh, because the idea of Gladys being my mother was actually kind of funny if you knew our history. "Oh no," I said, my voice light. "She's not my mum. My mother is long dead, actually. She passed away back in 2010. Gladys is the former owner. She just works here on Tuesdays to keep me in line." I said it casually, To me, it wasn't a tragedy in that moment. It was a fact. It's been over a decade. The sharp, jagged edges of that grief have been sanded down by time into a smooth, heavy stone I carry in my pocket. I don't talk about her every day, but I don't hide her existence either. She was real, she existed, and then she didn't. But the moment the words, "long dead," left my lips, the atmosphere in the store shifted. It was like I had dropped an ice cube down the back of the customer's shirt. The woman's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. Her eyes went wide, and she actually took a half step back from the counter. Her hands fluttered to her throat, clutching a necklace. Oh, heavens," she stammered. I am so sorry. I didn't mean, I'm so sorry." "It's okay," I said, trying to smooth things over, though I was confused by the intensity of her reaction. "You didn't know. It's really not a big deal. It was a long time ago." I tried to project. "I am fine." But it was too late. She looked horrified, like she had accidentally stepped on a kitten. She paid for her books in a frantic rush, barely waiting for her receipt, and practically bolted out the door. I watched her go, feeling a twinge of guilt, but mostly just bewilderment. Was dead such a dirty word? Did I need to use a euphemism? Should I have said she passed on or is no longer with us? I shrugged it off and turned to the next person in line, ready to move on. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. Standing right there, having witnessed the entire exchange, was another woman. Let's call her the moral arbiter. She had been browsing the nearby new arrivals shelf, and she was looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated judgment. She didn't even have books to buy. She just stepped up to the counter, leaned in, and lowered her voice to that sharp, condescending whisper that people use when they're about to tell you exactly what's wrong with your character. "That was incredibly rude," she hissed. I blinked, genuinely taken pipe. "I'm sorry? What was?" "Telling that poor woman your mother is dead," she said, shaking her head. "You made her feel awkward. You made her feel stupid for asking a simple, nice question. You should have just said, 'No, she's not my mother,' and left it at that. There was absolutely no need to bring death into a pleasant conversation." I felt a flash of heat rise in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the sheer absurdity of it. "But she is dead," I pointed out, my voice staying calm but firm. "Why is it rude to state a fact? She asked if she was my mother. If I just say no, it invites more questions. I was just giving her the context." The woman rolled her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my teeth ache. "It's about social grace. You don't just throw your trauma at people who are just trying to buy jam." You made her feel like a monster for asking a polite question. You really need to think about how you affect other people. She didn't wait for a response. She just huffed, turned on her heel, and marched out of the store, leaving me standing there behind my counter, surrounded by the smell of old books and raspberry jam, feeling like I had just been put on trial for a crime I didn't know existed. The bell above the door gave one final mocking chime as the moral arbiter disappeared onto the sidewalk. Silence rushed back into the store, but it wasn't the peaceful, scholarly silence I usually cherished. It was heavy. It felt like the air had been replaced with wet wool. I stood there, my hands still resting on the cool surface of the mahogany counter, staring at the spot where that woman had just lectured me on my own life. "Rude?" I whispered to the empty air. The word felt like a physical weight. I've always prided myself on being a person of quiet grace. I run a bookstore, for heaven's sake. I spend my days helping people find poetry and lost history. I'm not a confrontational person. I'm the one who lets people stay 10 minutes after closing because they're deeply immersed in a chapter. I'm the one who keeps a bowl of water outside for the neighborhood dogs. To be told, with such surgical precision, that I was the one lacking social grace felt like a direct assault on who I thought I was. I looked over at Gladys. She was still in the children's section, humming a soft tune while she straightened a stack of Dr. Seuss books. She hadn't heard the exchange, or if she had, she was doing a masterful job of pretending otherwise. Part of me wanted to run over to her, to ask her if I was a monster, but another part of me was too embarrassed to even bring it up. How do you explain to someone that you just got scolded for mentioning that your mother isn't alive? I turned back to the register, my mind spinning. I started thinking about that word. Dead. It's such a blunt, uncompromising word. 4 letters, 1 syllable. It doesn't have the soft, airy quality of passed away, or the poetic finality of gone to a better place. It's a clinical word. It's a biological fact. And apparently, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, in a shop that smells like cinnamon and old paper, it was a word that felt like a slap in the face to anyone who heard it. But why? I leaned my elbows on the counter and stared at the display of jams. My mother would have loved this shop. She was the one who taught me that a book isn't just a collection of pages. It's a door. She died in 2010 after a battle with cancer that was as short as it was brutal. In those final months, the world had shrunk down to the size of a hospital room, and then a hospice bed, and then just a memory. When you lose a parent, especially when you're relatively young, you go through several stages of how you talk about it. In the first year, you can barely say their name without your throat closing up. In the 5th year, you can talk about them, but there's always a catch in your breath, a moment where you have to brace yourself for the wave of grief. But by year 14? By year 14, their absence is just part of the architecture of your life. It's like a wall in your house. You don't think about the wall every day, but you know it's there. It's just a fact. So when the customer asked if Gladys was my mum, my brain didn't go to the trauma. It didn't go to the sterile smell of the oncology ward or the way the light looked in the funeral parlour. It just went to the filing cabinet of my life, pulled out the folder labelled Mother, and saw the stamp that said Deceased. I didn't think I was throwing my trauma at anyone. I thought I was answering a question. Everything okay, dear? I jumped slightly. Gladys had appeared at my side, her eyes searching mine with that intuitive kindness that makes her so good at her job. She had a jar of apricot preserves in her hand that she was moving to the front of the display. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile that felt tight and unnatural. Just a weird interaction with a customer, nothing major. Gladys tilted her head, her silver curls catching the light. People are strange sometimes. They come in here carrying all sorts of baggage, and sometimes they decide to unpack it right on your counter. Don't let them leave their heavy suitcases with you. I laughed, a real one this time. That's good advice, Gladys. I think one of them just tried to check a steamer trunk into my brain. She patted my hand, her skin like parchment but her grip still strong. Go take a breather. I've got the front. There's some tea in the back. I nodded and retreated to my small office behind the history section. It's a cramped space, filled with invoices, half-eaten granola bars, and my personal collection of unsellable books. The ones with too many coffee stains or missing covers that I love too much to throw away. I sat down in my creaky wooden chair and let out a long, slow breath, but the moral arbiter's voice wouldn't leave me. You made her feel awkward. You made her feel stupid. I started to replay the scene from the first customer's perspective. She was just trying to be nice. She saw 2 women working together in a cozy shop and imagined a heartwarming mother-daughter story. She wanted to connect. She wanted to share in a moment of wholesome small-town charm. And I had responded by dropping the D word into the middle of her fantasy. Was I supposed to lie? Was I supposed to say, no, she's just a friend, and let the woman keep her pleasant afternoon? But if I did that, I felt like I was erasing my mother. I felt like I was pretending she never existed, just to protect a stranger from the mild discomfort of realizing that life is finite. I thought about all the times I've had to navigate this. In your 30s and 40s, people ask about your parents all the time. Are your folks still around? Where do your parents live? It's a standard social lubricant. And every time I have to make a split-second decision. Do I give the long answer? The short answer? The euphemism? Usually, I just say, my mum passed a while ago. People usually say, I'm sorry, and we move on. It's a choreographed dance. But she's long dead. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was the long dead part. It sounds so ancient. Like I was talking about a character in a history book. Like I had no feeling left. But I do have feeling. I have so much feeling that I've spent the last 14 years building a life that would make her proud. Every time I curate a shelf, I think about what she would have liked to read. Every time I help a kid find a book about dinosaurs, I remember her taking me to the library on Saturday mornings. My mother isn't gone in the sense that she's forgotten. She's the foundation of everything I do. So why was it rude to acknowledge the reality of her passing? I stayed in my office for a long time, staring at a stack of unpaid bills, but seeing only the shocked face of the first customer and the judgmental eyes of the second. I started to wonder if I was losing my edge. If owning a business meant I had to become a sanitized version of myself, if I had to trade my truth for customer satisfaction. The bell chimed again out front. I heard Gladys greeting someone with her usual cheer. I knew I had to go back out there. I couldn't hide in my office forever, nursing a wound that was half grief and half indignation. I stood up, smoothed my apron, and took a deep breath. I told myself that I would be more careful. I would use the polite words. I would protect the customers from the harsh realities of the human condition. I would be the socially graceful bookseller they expected. But as I walked back toward the register, a thought occurred to me that made my blood run cold. What if the moral arbiter wasn't just a random crank? What if she was right? What if I was so desensitized to my own loss that I was walking around hurting people without even knowing it? I stepped back behind the counter just as a young man was setting a copy of The Great Gatsby down. He looked like a student, tired, a bit dishevelled, but with eyes that were bright with interest. "Hey," he said, giving me a nod. "Cool shop. My dad told me I had to check it out. He used to come here when he was my age, back when the old lady ran it." He gestured toward Gladys. I felt a lump form in my throat. Here it was again, a mention of the past, a mention of parents. "Gladys is great," I said, my voice slightly higher than usual as I tried to perform the politeness I'd just been lectured on. "She still helps out once a week." "That's awesome," the kid said. "I wish my dad could have come with me today, but he's not doing so great. Health stuff, you know?" He looked at me, his eyes searching for a connection, for a moment of shared understanding. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could give him the sanitized, polite response. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I hope he feels better." Or I could be real. I looked at the kid. I saw the worry in the corners of his eyes, the same worry I had carried for years. And I realized that politeness is often just another word for distance. "I'm sorry," I said, and this time I didn't laugh. I didn't use the word dead, but I didn't hide either. I know how hard that is. I lost my mum years ago, and honestly, the health stuff stage was the hardest part. Just hang in there. The kid's entire posture changed. He didn't look horrified. He didn't look like I'd ruined his day. He looked relieved. He looked like someone had finally handed him a glass of water in the middle of a desert. "Yeah," he breathed, his shoulders dropping. "Yeah, it really sucks. Everyone keeps telling me, he'll be fine, but he's 80. He might not be fine, you know?" "I know," I said. We talked for another 5 minutes. Not about the book, but about the weight of caring for someone you love. When he left, he didn't bolt for the door. He thanked me. He said he'd be back. I felt a surge of triumph. See? I wasn't the problem. The moral arbiter was wrong. Truth wasn't the enemy, it was the bridge. But just as I was starting to feel better, Gladys walked over. She had a strange look on her face. She leaned in close, her voice a low murmur. "Honey," she said, "I didn't want to say anything while the boy was here. But that woman from earlier, the one who scolded you, she's the head of the neighborhood association. And she just posted something on the local Facebook group about insensitive management at our store." My heart skipped a beat. The bridge I had just built felt like it was crumbling before I could even cross it. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, prickling sensation that started at my hairline and washed down to my toes. My hand went instinctively to my pocket, searching for my phone, but I hesitated. There's a specific kind of dread that comes with knowing you're being talked about in a digital space you can't control. It's the modern-day equivalent of being put in the village stocks, only the stones people throw are made of pixels and passive-aggressive adjectives. "What did she say, Gladys?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't want the 2 customers browsing the poetry section to hear me. I didn't want the walls of my sanctuary to know that someone was trying to tear them down from the outside. Gladys sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of her 71 years. She pulled her own phone from the pocket of her floral apron and tapped the screen a few times. She didn't hand it to me right away. She looked at me with a pained expression, the kind a mother gives a child before they have to deliver bad news. She's a very influential woman in this neighborhood, honey. Mrs. Gable. She's been the head of the Oakwood Heights Association for a decade. She thinks she owns the sidewalk as much as the houses." She finally turned the screen toward me. There it was. A post in the Oakwood Community Connections group, which had over 5,000 members. The heading was, "Disappointed in our local treasure." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll as I read the words. I've always loved supporting our local businesses, but today I had a deeply disturbing experience at the bookstore. I witnessed the current owner treat a well-meaning customer with such coldness and lack of empathy that it left me shaken. When asked a simple, friendly question about family, the owner responded with an incredibly blunt and jarring comment about death, completely disregarding the social grace and warmth we expect in our community. The poor customer was visibly distraught and fled the store. It's heartbreaking to see such a lack of basic human decency in a place that used to be so welcoming. I hope management realizes that words have power, and trauma dumping on unsuspecting neighbors is not how you run a business. We deserve better. I stared at the screen until the words began to blur. Trauma dumping, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I said 3 words. She is dead. How is that trauma dumping? I looked down at the comments. They were already piling up. "Oh no, I love that place, but that sounds horrible. Who wants to hear about death when they're buying a novel?" one person wrote. "I've noticed the vibe has changed since the transition," another added, someone who, I'm certain, had never even stepped foot in the store since I took over. "Gladys was always so sweet. This new person seems detached." "It's the main character syndrome," a third chimed in. "They think their personal history is everyone's business. So unprofessional." I felt like I was suffocating. These people didn't know me. They didn't know that I had spent the last 3 years pouring my life savings, my late night hours, and my entire heart into keeping this store alive. They didn't know that I kept Gladys on, not just because I loved her, but because I knew she needed the social connection as much as I needed her wisdom. And they certainly didn't know about 2010. I leaned back against the shelves, the hard spines of the books pressing into my spine. 2010, the year the world ended for me. My mother was 54. She was a librarian, the kind who could tell you exactly which book you needed based on the look in your eyes. She was my compass. When she got sick, it happened so fast that I didn't have time to process the if before I was dealing with the when. I spent 4 months in a hospital chair. I learned the smell of antiseptic and the sound of oxygen machines. I watched the most vibrant woman I knew turn into a shadow. And when she died, it wasn't a passing. It wasn't a journey to the other side. It was a violent, permanent subtraction. When you go through something like that, you develop a shorthand for it. You have to. If I let myself feel the full weight of her death every time someone asked about her, I wouldn't be able to function. So I say she's dead. I say it was 2010. I say it because it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing that keeps me grounded. But to Mrs. Gable and the 5,000 members of the Oakwood community group, my truth was a social faux pas. My reality was an insensitivity. I should respond, I said, my fingers hovering over Gladys's phone. I should tell them what actually happened, that I wasn't being cold, I was just being honest. Gladys gently took the phone back. No, dear, never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. If you respond now, you look defensive. You look like you're proving her point. So I just let her lie? She's making it sound like I stood on a table and screamed about a funeral. People who know you won't believe her, Gladys said softly. But most people don't know me, Gladys. They just know the store. And now they think the store is run by a sociopath who hates pleasant conversation. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a fog. Every time the bell rang, I felt a jolt of anxiety. Was this a regular who had seen the post? Was this a stranger coming in to inspect the rude bookstore owner? I found myself overperforming kindness. I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. I was being extra polite, using every sir and ma'am in my vocabulary, terrified that any slight slip of the tongue would end up on Facebook. The irony was sickening. In my attempt to be socially graceful, I felt like a fraud. I was hiding behind a mask of customer service, terrified of my own history. Around 5 p.m., a woman I recognized as a semi-regular, Sarah, came to the counter. She usually buys gardening books and cozy mysteries. Today, she had a single jar of Gladys's blackberry sage jam. She didn't look me in the eye as I rang her up. She kept her gaze fixed on the credit card reader. Everything okay today, Sarah? I asked, my voice high and hopeful. Fine, she clipped. She paused, then looked up, her expression guarded. I saw the post, on the neighborhood page. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sarah, that was a misunderstanding. I really didn't mean to. It just seems like a lot, she interrupted, shaking her head. We come here to get away from the heavy stuff, The world is hard enough right now. We just want a nice place to buy books without all that. All that? I asked, my voice trembling. You mean the fact that my mother is dead? Sarah winced as if I'd just used a profanity. See, that's what I mean. You're so blunt about it. It makes people uncomfortable. Maybe just keep it to yourself next time? She took her jam and walked out before I could respond. I stood there stunned. Keep it to yourself. That was the message. My grief was fine as long as it was invisible. My life was acceptable as long as it didn't disrupt the vibe of someone else's afternoon. I was being told to curate my existence like a window display. Only the pretty parts allowed. I looked over at Gladys. She was watching me, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet sadness. They're trying to edit you, honey, she said. Just like a manuscript. They want to cut out the chapters they don't like. But those are the chapters that made me who I am, I said, a tear finally escaping and hot tracking down my face. If I cut those out, there's nothing left but the cover. The sun was starting to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor of the shop. Usually, this was my favourite time of day. The golden hour in a bookstore is magical. But today, the shadows felt ominous. I realised then that this wasn't just about a Facebook post. This was a battle for the soul of my business. Did I want to run a place where people felt comfortable because everyone was lying? Or did I want to run a place that was real? But before I could decide, the door opened again. It wasn't a customer. It was a man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. He looked out of place among the shelves of fiction. "Are you the owner?" he asked, his voice professional and cold. "I am," I said, wiping my face and trying to regain my composure. "How can I help you?" "I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Gable and the Oakwood Heights Association," he said, stepping up to the counter. "We've had several complaints today regarding the atmosphere and management of this establishment. As a member of the local business improvement district, there are certain standards of conduct we expect. I'm here to deliver a formal notice of a hearing." My jaw dropped. A hearing? Over a comment about my dead mother? The absurdity of the situation had officially reached a breaking point. But as I looked at the legal-looking envelope in his hand, I realised that the politeness police weren't just complaining on Facebook anymore. They were coming for my dream. The man in the suit didn't linger. He didn't offer a sympathetic smile or a "just doing my job" shrug. He simply turned and walked out, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic finality that sounded like a ticking clock. I stood there, staring at the thick, cream-coloured envelope resting on my counter, right next to a jar of Gladys's apricot jam. The contrast was almost comical. The cold, bureaucratic weight of a legal notice, sitting beside a handmade symbol of warmth and sweetness. My hands were shaking as I reached for the envelope. I could feel Gladys's eyes on me, heavy with a mixture of pity and a kind of ancient, weary anger. I slid my thumb under the seal, the sound of the paper tearing feeling disproportionately loud in the quiet shop. The letterhead was embossed with the logo of the Oakwood Heights Business Improvement District. It looked official. It looked expensive. And as I read the first few lines, it felt like I was reading a script from a dystopian novel where unpleasantness had been outlawed. "Notice of Conduct Review," it began. It went on to cite various bylaws about maintaining the aesthetic and social harmony of the commercial corridor. It mentioned documented complaints of verbal insensitivity and actions detrimental to the community's reputation as a welcoming environment. There was a date for a hearing at the local community centre next Thursday, where I was invited to address these concerns before the board. "They can't do this," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "It's a bookstore. I haven't broken any laws. I haven't hurt anyone. I just told a woman my mother was dead." Gladys walked around the counter and put her arm around my shoulders. She smelled like lavender and old paper, a scent that had always been my anchor. "In a neighbourhood like this, honey, breaking the vibe is considered a crime. Mrs. Gable has spent 30 years turning this place into a living dollhouse. Anything that doesn't fit the picture, anything that's too real, too raw, she sees it as a crack in the porcelain." I looked at the letter again, my eyes stinging. She called it trauma dumping. Gladys, is that what I did? Did I dump my trauma on that woman? Gladys pulled me into a proper hug, the kind that makes you feel like you're 5 years old again. "No, you spoke the truth. People like Mrs. Gable, they think the truth is something you only share behind closed doors, with a box of tissues and a low voice. They think that out here in the world, we're all supposed to be characters in a brochure. But you aren't a character. You're a person. And your mother wasn't a plot point. She was your life." As I stood there in Gladys's embrace, my mind drifted back to 2010. It's funny how a single year can become a landmark in your mind, a jagged peak that divides your life into before and after. In the before, my mother was the person who would stay up until 2 a.m. reading the same book as me, just so we could talk about it over breakfast. She was the one who taught me that the smell of a library was the smell of infinite possibilities. She was vibrant, loud, and full of a restless, beautiful energy. In the after, there was just a void. A silence so profound it felt like I'd lost my hearing. The transition between those two worlds happened in a sterile room on the 4th floor of a hospital that always seemed to be too cold. I remember the exact way the light hit the linoleum floor when the doctor told us the treatments weren't working. I remember the way my mother's hand felt in mine, how it started out warm and strong, then became thin and translucent, and finally, how it became something else. Something still. When she died, it wasn't beautiful. It wasn't a peaceful passing like you see in the movies. It was a struggle. It was gasping for air. It was the sound of a machine flatlining, a sound that stayed in my ears for months afterward. It was the most real thing I had ever experienced. And maybe that's why I use the word dead. Because after seeing that, after living through the sheer, unvarnished reality of her end, words like past or gone feel like insults. They feel like they're trying to sugarcoat a mountain of iron. Dead is honest. Dead honours the gravity of what she went through. I pulled away from Gladys and looked around my shop. I had bought this place with the small inheritance she left me. Every shelf, every book, every jar of jam was a tribute to her. I had created a world where her spirit could live on, where the things she loved were celebrated every day. And now, a woman who didn't like the tone of my voice was trying to tell me I was a stain on the neighbourhood. "I'm not going to apologise," I said, my voice gaining a sudden sharp edge. "I'm not going to the hearing and saying I'm sorry for being insensitive, because I wasn't. I was being human." Gladys smiled, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "I love that spirit, I really do. But Mrs. Gable is powerful. She's friends with the landlord. She's friends with the city council. She can make things very difficult for this little shop. She doesn't have to win the hearing to ruin you. She just has to make it too expensive or too stressful for you to stay. So what am I supposed to do? Lie? Next time someone asks, do I say, 'Oh, she's on a long vacation in the clouds'?" Gladys sighed and walked over to the front window. She looked out at the street, where the streetlights were just starting to hum to life. "Mrs. Gable had a son," she said quietly. I froze. "What?" "Years ago, before you moved here. He was a bright boy, about your age. He died in a car accident just after he graduated college. It was devastating." I felt a sudden pang of empathy, but it was quickly followed by confusion. If she lost a son, then why is she so angry at me for mentioning my mum? Wouldn't she understand? Gladys turned back to me, her face shadowed by the evening light. "Because she never said the word. Not once. At the funeral, she talked about how he had transitioned to his next chapter. She refused to let anyone cry too loudly. She kept the house exactly as it was, like he was just out for a walk and might be back any minute. She spent 20 years pretending that death is just a social inconvenience that can be managed with enough poise and a well-curated Facebook feed." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Gable wasn't protecting the other customer from awkwardness. She was protecting herself. My words hadn't just been blunt. They had been a breach in the levee she had spent 2 decades building around her own grief. By saying, "My mother is dead," I had forced her to acknowledge that her son was too. "She's gaslighting the whole neighbourhood because she's gaslighting herself," I whispered. "Exactly," Gladys said. "And people like that, they don't want a conversation. They want a confession. They want you to admit that you're the broken one so they don't have to look at their own cracks." I looked down at the Notice of Conduct review. The paper felt different now. It didn't feel like a legal document. It felt like a cry for help disguised as a threat. But it was a threat nonetheless. The rest of the week was a slow-motion car crash. The Facebook posts continued to grow, spawning a thread of hundreds of comments. It had become a proxy war for the neighbourhood's identity. On one side were the Gableites, mostly older residents who valued decorum above all else. They talked about the sanctity of the shopping experience and how some things are better left unsaid. On the other side, a smaller but louder group of younger residents and long-time regulars started defending me. They used hashtags like #RealLifeBooks and #TruthInOakwood. They shared stories of how I'd helped them find books during their own hard times. The shop became a battleground. Some people would come in, look at me with narrowed eyes, buy nothing and leave. Others would come in and give me silent, supportive nods, or go out of their way to buy 5 jars of jam they clearly didn't need. The air in the store was no longer the smell of old paper and cinnamon. It was the smell of tension. Every interaction felt performative. I found myself second-guessing every word I said. If a child tripped, did I help them up too quickly? If someone asked for a recommendation, was my tone too detached? By Wednesday night, the evening before the hearing, I was a wreck. I was sitting on the floor of the travel section, surrounded by books on the Mediterranean. The cruise Gladys was supposed to be on, but she had offered to stay and help me. "I can't do this, Gladys," I said, burying my face in my hands. "I just wanted to sell books. I didn't want to be the centre of a culture war. Maybe I should just close the shop for a few days. Let it blow over." "If you close, they win," Gladys said, her voice firm. "They'll say you were ashamed or unstable. You have to show up. You have to stand in that community centre and tell them who you are." "But who am I?" I asked, looking up at her. "Am I the rude person Mrs. Gable says I am? Or am I the person who can't stop thinking about a hospital room in 2010? "You're both," Gladys said, "and that's the most beautiful thing about you." Just then, the bell above the door chimed. It was late, past closing time, but I'd forgotten to lock the door. I stood up, wiping my eyes, expecting to see another process server or a disgruntled neighbour, but it was the woman from the first day. The one who had asked if Gladys was my mum. She looked different. Her hair was messy and her eyes were red-rimmed. She wasn't carrying a purse, just a small, crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She stopped in the doorway, looking around the darkened shop until her eyes landed on me. "I saw the post," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw what they're saying about you." My heart sank. I braced myself for another lecture, another accusation of trauma dumping. "I'm so sorry," I started, the practiced apology ready on my tongue. "I never meant to make you feel—" "No," she interrupted, stepping forward into the light. "No, you don't understand. I didn't flee because I was distraught by what you said. I didn't feel stupid or awkward." She held out the crumpled piece of paper. I took it, my fingers brushing hers. It was a photograph, a picture of a young girl, maybe 6 years old, with the same bright eyes as the woman standing in front of me. "My daughter," the woman whispered. "She died 6 months ago. Brain fever. It was so fast." The silence that followed was different than any silence I'd ever known. It was a silence of recognition. "When I asked if Gladys was your mum," the woman continued, tears starting to stream down her face, "I was just looking for a happy ending. I was looking for a world where people grow old together. And when you said she was long dead, it was like someone finally spoke my language. You didn't use a euphemism. You didn't try to make it pretty. You just said the truth." And it was the first time since my daughter died that I didn't feel like I was the only person in the world who knew what that word actually meant. She looked at me, her gaze intense. "I didn't run away because I was offended. I ran away because I was going to burst into tears right there at your counter, and I wasn't ready for people to see me. I wasn't ready for the politeness of this neighbourhood to swallow me whole." I felt a sob rise in my own throat. I didn't even think. I walked around the counter and took her hands. "Mrs. Gable told everyone I ruined your day," I said, my voice cracking. "Mrs. Gable doesn't know anything about my day," the woman said, her voice gaining strength. "She doesn't know anything about my life, and I'm not going to let her tell my story for me. I heard there's a hearing tomorrow." I nodded. "I'll be there," she said, "and I think it's time we stopped being so polite." The night before the hearing felt like the vigil I'd held 14 years ago in that hospital room. The air was thick with a sense of impending finality, but this time I wasn't watching a life flicker out. I was watching the walls of my own world tremble. Clara, that was the woman's name, stayed in the shop with Gladys and me until well past midnight. We didn't turn on the overhead lights. We sat in the glow of the green banker's lamps in the history section, 3 women bound together by the very thing society told us to hide. We shared stories, not the polite ones you tell at dinner parties, but the jagged, ugly ones. Clara told us about the way her house felt too large now, how she'd catch herself setting a 3rd plate at the table and then have to scrape the food into the trash while her heart felt like it was being put through a paper shredder. Gladys spoke about the quiet desperation of aging in a neighbourhood that only valued the new and the shiny. And I talked about my mum, really talked about her, for the first time in years. I told them about the way she used to mark her place in books by folding the corners of the pages, a habit that used to drive me crazy and now makes me smile every time I see it in a used paperback. Mrs. Gable thinks she's protecting the community, Clara said, her voice steady now, though her eyes were still red. But she's just building a graveyard and calling it a garden. She wants us all to be statues, perfectly still and perfectly silent. Well, I'm tired of being a statue. The next morning, the Oakwood Community Centre felt more like a courtroom than a gathering place for neighbours. The building was a mid-century brick structure with high ceilings and the faint, lingering scent of floor wax and old gymnasium air. As I walked up the steps, Gladys on one side and Clara on the other, I felt the weight of 100 eyes. The main hall was packed. Mrs. Gable had clearly been busy on her phone. The front 3 rows were filled with the Gableites, men in crisp polo shirts and women in twin sets and pearls, the self-appointed guardians of Oakwood's charm. They were whispering among themselves, their voices a low, rhythmic hum that cut out the moment I entered the room. It was the kind of silence that has teeth. At the front of the room sat a long, folding table. 5 board members of the Business Improvement District looked down at me. In the centre was Mrs. Gable. She looked impeccable, not a silver hair out of place, her suit a shade of navy so dark it was almost black. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed, which, as anyone who has ever had a mother knows, is infinitely worse. "Thank you all for coming," Mrs. Gable began, her voice amplified by a small tinny microphone. "We are here today because the Oakwood Heights Association believes that our local businesses are more than just shops. They are the heartbeat of our community. They represent our values, our hospitality, and our shared commitment to a high quality of life. When that harmony is disrupted, when the atmosphere of our street is tainted by unhelpful attitudes, it is our responsibility to step in." She looked directly at me then, her gaze cold and clinical. "We have received numerous reports regarding the Book and Jar, complaints about the owner's conduct, specifically an incident involving a customer who was left visibly shaken by a jarring and, frankly, macabre interaction. There are also concerns that the current management lacks the Oakwood spirit that Gladys so beautifully cultivated for decades." The room erupted in a chorus of murmurs and hears. I felt my face flush. It was a public shaming, plain and simple. She was painting me as a dark cloud over their perfect little sunlit street. "I'd like to call our first witness," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, who witnessed the aftermath of the incident." Sarah, the woman who had told me to keep it to myself, stood up. She looked nervous but determined. She spoke about the palpable tension in the store. She talked about how uncomfortable it made her feel to know that the owner was dwelling on such dark things, while she was just trying to buy her weekly mystery novel. "It's about the children too," another man added from the second row, standing up without being called. "We bring our grandkids to that shop. Do we want them exposed to that kind of bluntness? Do we want them asking questions about death before they're ready? It's irresponsible." I looked at Gladys. She was gripping the edge of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. I looked at Clara. She was staring at Mrs. Gable with an expression I couldn't quite read. It looked like pity. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I walked up to the small podium, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I looked out at the sea of faces, people I had served coffee to, people I had helped find the perfect gift for their spouses, people who were now looking at me like I was a stranger. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, I started, my voice shaking. I took a breath and gripped the sides of the podium to keep from trembling. "I bought the book and jar because I believe in the power of stories. And stories aren't just about happy endings. They're about the middle too. They're about the parts that hurt. They're about the losses that change us." "We aren't here for a lecture on literature," Mrs. Gable interrupted, her voice sharp. "We are here to discuss your professionalism. Do you deny that you told a customer your mother was long dead, in a manner that caused her distress?" "I don't deny saying it," I said, finding a sudden, unexpected spark of anger deep in my chest. "Because it's the truth. My mother died in 2010. She was 54. She was my best friend. And the idea that I have to lie about her existence or her absence to make a transaction pleasant is an insult to her memory." A woman in the back gasped. Mrs. Gable narrowed her eyes. "There is a time and a place, dear. A used bookstore is not a therapy couch. You were asked a polite question, and you responded with a verbal assault. You made that woman feel like a monster for simply being friendly." "No," a voice rang out from the side of the room. "She didn't." The room went silent. Everyone turned. Clara was standing up. She walked slowly toward the front, her head held high. She didn't look like the woman who had bolted from my store 3 days ago. She looked like a woman who had finally found her voice. "I'm the woman Mrs. Gable is talking about," Clara said, addressing the board. "I'm the one who asked about the jars. I'm the one who fled the store." Mrs. Gable blinked, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Oh, Clara dear, you don't have to do this. We understand how traumatic it was for you." "You don't understand anything, Diane," Clara said, using Mrs. Gable's first name with a coldness that made the room temperature drop 10 degrees. "I didn't leave because I was offended. I left because for the first time in 6 months, someone looked at me and spoke the truth. I lost my daughter last year, my 6-year-old girl, and for 6 months, every person in this neighborhood has been polite to me. They've told me she's in a better place. They've told me time heals all wounds. They've treated my grief like a mess they didn't want to step in." Clara turned to look at the crowd, her eyes blazing. "You talk about the Oakwood spirit? If the Oakwood spirit means we have to pretend our loved ones never existed the moment they stop breathing, then I don't want any part of it. This woman," she gestured toward me, "didn't trauma dump on me. She gave me air. She acknowledged the reality that we all face but are too cowardly to name. She said her mother was dead, and in that moment she told me it was okay that my daughter was too." The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was electric. I saw a few people in the middle rows look down at their laps. I saw an older man in the back wipe his eyes with a handkerchief. That Mrs. Gable wasn't backing down. Her face had gone from navy to a pale, ghostly white. Her hands were trembling on the table. That is quite enough," Mrs. Gable stammered. "This is a business review, not a grief support group. We have standards, we have—" "What are you so afraid of, Diane?" Gladys's voice cut through the air. She stood up, her small frame suddenly looking like a giant in the room. "We've known each other for 40 years. I was there when you lost your son. I was there when you told the funeral director not to use the word death in the program. You've been running from that word for 2 decades, and you've been trying to make this whole neighborhood run with you. But you can't outrun it. And you certainly can't punish this girl for having the courage to stand still." Mrs. Gable looked like she had been struck. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The Gableites around her were silent, the unified front finally cracking. I looked at the 5 board members. They were looking at each other, their expressions ranging from discomfort to realization. The conduct review was falling apart in real time. But as I looked at Mrs. Gable, at the raw, naked pain in her eyes that was finally, after 20 years, beginning to leak through the porcelain, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a deep, hollow sadness. I realized then that this wasn't about my store. It was about a woman who had built a fortress of politeness to keep her heart from breaking, and I had accidentally knocked a stone loose. The silence in the community centre was no longer the sharp, judging quiet of a courtroom. It had transformed into something thick and suffocating, the kind of silence that usually only exists in the heavy air right before a thunderstorm breaks. I looked at Mrs. Gable, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't see the moral arbiter of Oakwood Heights. I didn't see a powerful woman with the ability to shut down my dreams with a single phone call. I saw a mother who had lost her son and had never found the words to say it. Her hand, which had been resting so confidently on the microphone just moments ago, was now shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor that made the diamonds on her rings catch the fluorescent light in a frantic, jagged dance. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. It was as if the word death, spoken aloud in the middle of her carefully curated world, had finally punctured the vacuum she had been living in for 20 years. The air was rushing back in, and it was cold. The chairman of the board, a man named Mr. Henderson, who usually spent his time complaining about the height of people's hedges, cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the still room. He looked at Mrs. Gable, then at me, then at Clara, who was still standing like a sentinel in the centre aisle. "I think," Henderson began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I think perhaps we've lost sight of the purpose of this board. We are here to support our local economy, not to police the personal conversations of our neighbours." He looked down at the notice of conduct review sitting in front of him. With a slow, deliberate movement, he slid the paper toward the centre of the table and turned it over. "Mrs. Gable," he said, turning to her. "Diane, do you have anything further to add to the record?" She didn't look at him. She was staring at a spot on the back wall, her eyes wide and glassy. She looked like she was seeing something miles away, or perhaps 20 years in the past. "The meeting is adjourned," Henderson announced, his voice firmer now. "The board finds no violation of conduct. The Book and Jar remains a valued member of the Oakwood Heights Business District." There was a scattered, uncertain round of applause from the back of the room. The younger residents, the regulars, the people who had come to stand in the gap for me. But the front rows, the Gableites, remained frozen. They were looking at their leader, waiting for a signal, a word, a command. But Diane Gable was gone. She stood up, her movements stiff and mechanical, like a wind-up toy running out of tension. She didn't look at the board, and she didn't look at me. She gathered her leather portfolio, tucked it under her arm, and walked down the side aisle toward the exit. The crowd parted for her like she was a ghost. She moved through the room in a bubble of absolute isolation. I watched her go, and instead of the triumph I thought I'd feel, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I had just watched someone's house burn down. "Go to her," Gladys whispered in my ear. I looked at her, shocked. "What? After everything she tried to do to me? She tried to ruin my life, Gladys." "She's been trying to ruin her own life for 20 years, honey," Gladys said, her eyes moist. "She just didn't know how to stop until you pushed her. She needs a human being right now, not a neighbour. Go." I looked at Clara, who gave me a small, solemn nod. I didn't think. I just moved. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the community centre, just as Mrs. Gable reached the sidewalk. The evening air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the first hints of autumn. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. "Mrs. Gable!" I called out. She didn't stop. She kept walking toward her pristine white SUV parked at the curb. "Diane!" That stopped her. She froze with her hand on the door handle. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed. I caught up to her, stopping a few feet away. My heart was pounding, not with anger anymore, but with a terrifying kind of empathy. "I'm sorry," I said. She finally turned. Her face was a mask of grief, the lines around her mouth deep and jagged. She looked 10 years older than she had an hour ago. "What are you sorry for?" she asked, her voice a ragged whisper. "You got what you wanted. You kept your store. You made me look like a fool in front of the whole neighborhood." "I didn't want any of that," I said, taking a step closer. "I just wanted to be real. And I'm sorry that being real hurt you. I didn't know about your son." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "No one knows about my son. That's the point. I made sure of it. I thought if I could just keep everything perfect, if I could make this neighborhood look like a storybook, then maybe it wouldn't be true. Maybe he'd just be away, somewhere else." She leaned against her car, the polished metal looking cold against her silk suit. "But he's not somewhere else," she said, her voice breaking. "He's dead. He's been dead for 22 years, and I haven't said it out loud since the day they told me." I reached out, my hand hovering in the air between us before I finally touched her arm. She didn't pull away. "My mum is dead too," I said softly. "And it sucks. It's the worst thing in the world. And no amount of Oakwood spirit or polite conversation is ever going to change that. But pretending it didn't happen? It just makes the hole bigger, Diane. It doesn't fill it." For a long minute, we just stood there on the quiet street. Two women, decades apart in age, standing in the shadow of their ghosts. "I hated you," she whispered. "I hated you the moment you said those words in the shop. I hated you for being so casual about it, like it was nothing." "It's not nothing," I said. "It's everything. That's why I have to say it. If I don't say it, it feels like she's disappearing all over again." Diane looked at me then, really looked at me. The hardness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, searching vulnerability. "I don't know how to do it," she said. "I don't know how to be a person who has a dead son." "You start by saying it," I said, "and then you come to the shop on Tuesday. Gladys makes blackberry jam. We can sit in the back and you can tell me his name." She didn't promise she'd come. She didn't apologize for the hearing or the Facebook post. She just nodded, climbed into her car, and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching her taillights disappear. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Gladys. "You did good, honey," she said. "Did I? I think I just broke the most powerful woman in Oakwood." "No," Gladys said, looking up at the first stars appearing in the sky. "You didn't break her. You just helped her finally fall apart. Sometimes that's the only way you can put yourself back together." We walked back toward the shop. The lights were still on, and I could see Clara through the front window, sitting at the counter with a cup of tea, looking at the shelves of books. It was a new world. The Book and Jar wasn't just a place to buy things anymore. It had become something else. A sanctuary for the unvarnished truth. The morning after the hearing, the sun rose over Oakwood Heights with a clarity that felt almost aggressive. I woke up before my alarm, my body still hummed with the residual adrenaline of the night before. Usually, I'd lie in bed for 20 minutes, dreading the opening of the shop or scrolling through the latest neighborhood gossip on my phone. But today was different. I didn't look at Facebook. I didn't care about the comments or the likes or the unhelpful reviews. I just got up, made a pot of coffee, and walked to the store. When I arrived at the Book and Jar, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just looking at it. The gold lettering on the window, books, jams, curiosities, gleamed in the early light. It looked the same, yet it felt like the very foundation had shifted. I unlocked the door, and the bell gave its familiar, cheery chime. Inside, the air was still. The smell of old paper and the faint, sweet, lingering scent of Gladys's apricot preserves greeted me like an old friend. I started my morning ritual, turning on the lamps, straightening the displays, checking the new arrivals. But as I worked, I noticed something. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't worried about whether my smile was wide enough or if my tone was too blunt. The politeness police had been disbanded, or at least their headquarters had been shaken to its core. By 10 o'clock, the first few customers started to trickle in. I braced myself for the tension, but it never came. Instead, something miraculous happened. People weren't just buying books. They were talking. Really talking. An older man I'd seen a dozen times but never spoken to beyond a "good morning" came to the register with a biography of Winston Churchill. He set it down, looked me in the eye and said, "I was at the hearing last night. I lost my wife 3 years ago. Everyone keeps telling me she's resting, but she's not. She's just gone. And it's nice to know there's a place in this town where I don't have to pretend otherwise." He didn't want a long conversation. He didn't want a therapy session. He just wanted to be seen in his reality. I nodded, rang up his book and said, "I'm sorry for your loss. It's hard when the world expects you to keep the lights on when yours have gone out." He gave me a small, tight smile, the first real smile I think I'd ever seen from him, and left. Throughout the day it kept happening. It was like a dam had burst. People who had lived on the same street for decades, nodding politely and talking about the weather, were suddenly sharing the parts of themselves they had been told to keep hidden. The Book and Jar was transforming from a retail space into a sanctuary of the unvarnished truth. We weren't just selling used novels and jam. We were selling permission. Permission to be human. Permission to be sad. Permission to be honest. Even the Facebook group had shifted. Gladys called me halfway through the afternoon to tell me that the Oakwood Community Connections page was undergoing a revolution. Someone had posted a public apology to me, which had triggered a thread of other people admitting they had felt pressured by the neighborhood aesthetic to hide their own struggles. The post that Mrs. Gable had started was still there, but it was now buried under hundreds of messages of support and shared stories of loss. But through all the support, there was one person I couldn't stop thinking about. Diane Gable. I wondered if she was sitting in her pristine living room, surrounded by the silence she had cultivated for 20 years. I wondered if she was looking at the photos of her son, the ones she'd probably kept hidden or framed in a way that made him look like he was just on a long vacation. I wondered if she hated me even more, now that the Oakwood spirit she'd built had turned its back on her. Tuesday arrived, and with it came Gladys. She walked in carrying 2 crates of fresh blackberries, her face glowing. "The harvest is good this year, honey," she said, setting the crates on the counter. "Tart and sweet, just the way they should be." "Gladys," I said, helping her move the berries to the back kitchen. "Do you think she'll come?" Gladys didn't need to ask who she was. "I don't know. 20 years is a long time to spend building a wall. It doesn't all come down in one night. But she knows the door is open. That's all you can do." We spent the morning in a comfortable rhythm. Gladys was in the back, the sound of bubbling sugar and the rhythmic thwap-thwap of her wooden spoon creating a heartbeat for the store. I was out front, shelving a collection of vintage poetry. The bell chimed at 11:30 a.m. I looked up, my heart doing a strange, fluttering dance in my chest. It wasn't Diane. It was the young student from a few days ago, the one who had talked about his dad. He looked better, not happy, but lighter. "Hey," he said, coming up to the counter. "I just wanted to say thanks for what you said the other day. My dad, he had a rough night, but we talked. Really talked. No, he'll be fine bullshit, just the truth. It made it easier." "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it. "How's he doing today?" "He's tired," the kid said, "but he told me to bring him something to read, something about the sea. He used to be a sailor." I spent 20 minutes helping him find the perfect book, a weathered copy of The Old Man and the Sea, and a beautiful hardcover about the history of the Pacific. When he left, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since I first opened the shop. But as the afternoon wore on, the shadow of Diane Gable grew longer. 2 o'clock passed. 3 o'clock. Gladys came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, the smell of blackberry jam clinging to her like a perfume. "No sign of her?" she asked softly. "No," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. "Maybe it was too much. Maybe I shouldn't have pushed her." "You didn't push her, dear. You just turned on the lights. Some people need time for their eyes to adjust." Just as the sun began its descent, casting those long amber shadows across the floorboards, the bell chimed one last time. I was in the back of the store, and I didn't see who it was at first. I just heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and slightly hesitant. I walked toward the front, and there she was. Diane Gable wasn't wearing a suit today. She was in a simple grey sweater and slacks. Her hair was still neat, but she wasn't wearing any jewellery, and her face was devoid of the heavy makeup she usually used as a shield. She looked smaller, fragile, like a piece of fine china that had been glued back together. She was standing in front of the jam display, her hand hovering over a jar of the blackberry preserves Gladys had just put out. "It smells wonderful in here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the blackberries," I said, staying behind the counter, giving her space. "Gladys just finished a batch." Diane looked up at me. Her eyes weren't cold anymore. They were swimming with a depth of sorrow that was almost hard to look at. "His name was Thomas," she said. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering like dust motes in a beam of light. "Thomas," I repeated, my voice soft. "That's a beautiful name." "He was 22, she continued, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. "He wanted to be an architect. He used to draw these incredible buildings on the backs of his napkins at dinner. He had so much space in him. He was going to build worlds." She walked over to the counter and sat down on one of the small wooden stools I kept for customers who wanted to linger. She looked at her hands, her fingers interlaced tightly. "When the police came to the door, I remember thinking that if I didn't say the word, if I didn't let them finish the sentence, then it wouldn't be real. I thought I could hold the world together with my own silence. And then I never stopped holding." Gladys came out from the back then. She didn't say anything. She just walked over to the counter, took a small plate, and put a piece of toasted bread on it with a generous dollop of the warm blackberry jam. She set it in front of Diane, along with a cup of tea. Diane looked at the jam, and then she looked at Gladys. And then, for the first time in 22 years, the moral arbiter of Oakwood Heights began to cry. It wasn't a polite cry. It wasn't a silent tear sliding down a cheek. It was a deep, gut-wrenching sob that came from the very center of her being. It was the sound of a levee finally breaking. It was the sound of 22 years of politeness being washed away by the truth. I walked around the counter and stood beside her. I didn't hug her. I didn't think she was ready for that. But I put my hand on the back of her chair. "He's dead, Diane," I said, my voice thick with my own emotion. "Thomas is dead, and it's the most unfair, horrible thing in the universe. But he was real. He was here, and you don't have to hide him anymore." She reached out and gripped my hand, her fingers digging into my skin with a desperate strength. "He was here," she sobbed. "He was my boy. He was here." We sat like that for a long time. The store grew dark around us, the only light coming from the street lamps outside and the soft glow of the lamp on the counter. We talked about Thomas. We talked about my mother. We talked about the way the world tries to make us small when we're hurting, and how the only way to stay big is to be honest. When Diane finally left, she didn't look like the woman who had walked in. She looked exhausted, yes, but she also looked present. She took a jar of the blackberry jam with her. "I'll see you next Tuesday?" I asked as she reached the door. She paused, the bell jingling softly above her head. She turned and gave me a look that I will never forget. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition. "Next Tuesday," she said. As I locked the door for the night, I realized that the rude thing I had done, the blunt, jarring, insensitive comment about my mother being dead, hadn't just saved my store. It had saved a neighborhood. It had reminded us all that behind every pleasant afternoon and every polite smile, there is a human heart, beating with all its messy, beautiful, tragic truth. And that truth is the only thing that ever really matters. In the weeks that followed, the book and jar underwent a transformation that no business plan or marketing strategy could have ever predicted. It wasn't a physical change. The shelves were still the same dark mahogany, the floorboards still groaned in the same spots, and the air still carried that intoxicating blend of old paper and Gladys's seasonal preserves. But the spirit of the place had shifted. It was as if a heavy, invisible curtain had been pulled back, letting in a light that was both harsher and more beautiful than anything we'd seen before. The neighborhood, too, began to breathe differently. It was subtle at first. You'd see two neighbors talking on the sidewalk, and instead of the usual rapid-fire exchange about lawn care or school schedules, they'd be standing still, looking at each other with an intensity that suggested they were actually listening. The Oakwood spirit was being redefined, not by the perfection of our flower beds, but by the honesty of our scars. I decided to create what I called the Truth Shelf. It started as a small display near the history section, right where Clara had first stood. I curated it carefully, filling it with memoirs of loss, poetry written in the depths of despair, and novels that didn't shy away from the jagged edges of the human experience. I put a small handwritten sign above it that simply said, "For the parts of us we don't talk about." Beside the books, I placed a glass bowl and a stack of small blank cards. I invited people to write down the name of someone they had lost, or a truth they were tired of hiding, and drop it in the bowl. I didn't think anyone would actually do it. I thought it might be too blunt for Oakwood, even after the hearing. But on the first day, the bowl was half full. By the end of the week, I had to buy a larger one. People weren't just dropping names. They were leaving stories. Small, heart-wrenching fragments of lives that had been lived and lost. My sister, Sarah, she loved the ocean. The dream of the art gallery I never opened. My father, who died in 2004, and whose voice I'm starting to forget. I'd catch people standing in front of that shelf, reading the cards through the glass, their faces reflecting a mixture of sorrow and a profound, visible relief. They were realizing they weren't alone in their unpleasantness. The bookstore had become a map of the neighborhood's collective heart, showing all the places where we were broken and all the ways we were trying to heal. One Tuesday afternoon, about a month after the hearing, a man named Arthur walked in. He was one of the Gableites, a man I remembered seeing in the front row of the community centre, nodding along to everything Diane had said. He was a retired accountant, always dressed in impeccably pressed khakis and a button-down shirt. He looked like the poster child for Oakwood decorum. He walked straight to the counter, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He held a book in his hands, a worn, leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. "I heard you take donations for the Truth Shelf," he said, his voice stiff and formal, as if he were filing a tax return. "I do, Arthur," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "Is this a special copy?" He finally looked up, and I saw that his eyes were glassy. He set the book on the counter and ran a hand over the cover, his fingers lingering on the frayed edges. "It belonged to my wife," he said. "She passed away 7 years ago. Lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life. It felt like a mistake. Like the universe had made a clerical error." He paused, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "After she died, Diane, Mrs. Gable, came over. She told me that the best way to honor her was to keep up appearances. She told me that the neighborhood needed me to stay strong, to keep the house looking right, to not make people feel uncomfortable with my grief. So I did. I tucked her books away in the attic. I stopped talking about her. I thought I was being a good citizen." He looked around the shop, his gaze landing on the glass bowl filled with cards. "But then I saw that hearing, and I saw what you said, and I realized that for 7 years, I've been living in a house that feels like a museum, not a home. I don't want to keep up appearances anymore. I want people to know that I'm lonely. I want them to know that I miss her every single time I make a pot of coffee. I felt that familiar lump in my throat, the one that had become a constant companion since this journey began. Thank you for sharing that with me, Arthur. Would you like to put her name in the bowl? He nodded, his hands shaking as he wrote Martha on a card. He dropped it in, and as it settled among the hundreds of other names, he let out a long, shuddering breath. He didn't look distraught or macabre. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for far too long. As autumn deepened, the shop became even more of a hub for these quiet, revolutionary acts of honesty. Gladys was in her element. She started a grief and grits morning once a month, where people could come in before the shop opened, have some of her homemade biscuits and jam, and just talk. No agendas, no politeness, just human beings being real with one another. And then there was Diane. She didn't come every Tuesday, but she came often enough that her presence no longer felt like a shock. She was different now. She still walked with a certain poise, but the rigid porcelain mask had shattered. She spent a lot of time in the back with Gladys, learning how to make the jams. She said it helped to work with her hands, to create something sweet out of something tart. One rainy afternoon in November, Diane brought a large, flat portfolio with her. She waited until the shop was empty, then laid it out on the counter. "I found these," she said, her voice steady, "in the back of the closet. I haven't looked at them in 20 years. She opened the portfolio. Inside were dozens of architectural sketches. They were brilliant, soaring towers, intricate bridges, parks that looked like they belonged in a dream. They were signed in the bottom corner with a bold, youthful hand. Thomas Gable. He was so talented, I whispered, tracing the lines of a bridge that seemed to defy gravity. He wanted to fix things, Diane said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. He used to say that buildings were just a way to hold people together. I think he would have liked this shop. He would have liked what you've done here." She looked at me then, and for the first time I didn't see any of the old resentment. I spent so long trying to protect his memory by hiding it. I thought if I didn't let anyone see the pain, they wouldn't see the loss. But all I did was make him disappear. "Thank you for not letting me do that to you. We're all just trying to keep the lights on, Diane," I said. That night, after I closed the shop, I stayed behind for a while. The rain was drumming a rhythmic tattoo on the roof, and the street lights were reflecting in the puddles outside, creating shimmering ribbons of gold. I sat on the stool by the register and looked at the truth shelf. I thought about my mother. I thought about 2010. I thought about the hospital room and the cold linoleum and the way her hand felt in mine. For 14 years, I had been defined by her death. I had used the word dead as a shield, a way to keep people at a distance, to tell them that the part of me that was her was off limits. But through this journey, through the confrontation with Mrs. Gable and the alliance with Clara and the honesty of people like Arthur, I realized that I didn't have to use her death as a shield anymore. I could use it as a bridge. My mother wasn't just long dead. She was the reason I loved books. She was the reason I cared about people's stories. She was the reason this shop existed. By being honest about her end, I had finally allowed her life to truly breathe in this space. I stood up and walked over to the glass bowl. I took a card and a pen. I didn't write Mum. I didn't write a date. I dropped the card into the bowl and watched it settle. I felt a sense of completion, a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. I had fought for my right to be honest, and in doing so, I had given a whole community the right to be whole. Looking back on it now, I wonder what would have happened if I had just been polite that day. If I had just smiled and said, "No, she's not my mum," and let the customer walk away with her pleasant, sanitized version of reality. My life would have been easier, certainly. I wouldn't have been the subject of a Facebook firestorm. I wouldn't have been threatened with a conduct review. I wouldn't have had to face the wrath of Diane Gable. But I also wouldn't have met Clara. I wouldn't have seen Arthur finally find peace. I wouldn't have helped Diane Gable say her son's name out loud for the first time in 2 decades. We live in a world that is obsessed with the vibe. We are told to keep it light, to keep it positive, to curate our lives like a window display where nothing is ever broken and nothing ever dies. But the truth is, we are all broken in some way. We have all lost something or someone that we didn't know how to live without. And when we hide those parts of ourselves, we don't just protect others from discomfort. We isolate ourselves in our own shadows. We turn our neighborhoods into museums and our hearts into graveyards. But when we speak the truth, when we use the blunt words and share the unpleasant realities, we create a space where we can actually find each other. We turn our losses into a language that everyone can understand. So, I have to ask you, have you ever been told to keep it to yourself? Have you ever felt like your truth was an inconvenience to someone else's pleasant afternoon? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. We spend so much time performing for each other. Maybe it's time we started being real instead. And if you've ever found comfort in a place like the Book and Jar, or if you believe that honesty is more important than decorum, consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories like this every week. Stories that aren't always pretty, but are always true. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to find our way through the chapters, and it's a lot easier when we're reading from the same page. I turned off the final lamp, the click of the switch echoing in the quiet store. I walked to the door, stepped out into the cool night air, and locked the door behind me. As I walked home through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights, I didn't feel like a stranger or a villain. I felt like I was